psychological research. So in this lesson, we get into the scientific method, and I chose that not because they need to know the scientific method, but I feel like it's a concept and a process that is consistent across all methods in psychology, so that, these guys have to know so much about quantitative, qualitative, specific methods, whereas really we can use the scientific method actually as a framework to answer some of the exam questions. But regardless, if they understand the general process, right? I think it can be a really helpful foundation for understanding research methods later. And this introduces, it's a softball approach to introducing the idea of studies. A Kahoot, short quiz, discussion, any real world behaviors they observed, bit of chalk and talk. This is what the scientific method looks like. And I love showing students this. Again, the first 5 classes, I want students to get excited about psychology, the guy dancing on the hill, the staring competition, this field experiment. This is where the guy goes around and says, I've noticed you're around campus, would you like to go home? Would you like to sleep with me? And vice versa. If you don't think this is appropriate for your context, remove it. But I like this, but this is a guided practice at looking at the scientific method. And so, what did they observe? And I took that quote there from the original study, and we can talk through, right? This is how the scientific method looks, and the idea that, well, we could have just most people stop here and they just make these anecdotal observations of the world, like, I think men are more promiscuous or want to be more promiscuous than women are, and then but that's it, right? But can we really base our knowledge on anecdotal data? No, we go through the scientific method. So we turn that into a question, we design an experiment to test it, then we get some hard data, analyze the data, draw conclusions, and publish. All right. Quick chalk and talk to explain the difference between empirical and anecdotal. I've changed my tune on anecdotal evidence. I used to write it off completely, but now I realize it's actually really valuable for the first step in the scientific method, the observation, right? The anecdotal observation of what happens in the real world sparks the scientific method, but we can't base our knowledge on that. So we have to use the empirical evidence as well. And then we're getting into the Kitty Genovese story, the idea of the scientific method and studies. If you have a copy of Lawrence Slater's Opening Skinner's Box, I'm pretty sure from memory there's a really harrowing account of this in the opening to that. But otherwise, they can just read it in their workbooks, or you can tell the story as much as you know it. And I've rewritten this. This also appears in the textbook, but I've rewritten it here to remove the obvious references to the scientific method. So they read through that and try to identify the steps, right? So what was the observation? What was the research question, etc., etc. And there's space in the workbook for them to write that down. And then you can go through the answers. I used to get students to try to design their own studies in the introductory unit, and I realized it was just a little bit too tricky for them. So this is why I've adapted it to this. As usual, we finish with the workbook. Now, I'll just point out here, if you find that you've run out of time, you've finished the activities in the lesson plans sooner than you anticipated, I've added a bunch at the end of the unit plan, time fillers and alternative activities. So you can have those on standby if you need to. I added this here at the end. It might make more sense to put it up earlier in the slideshow, but just in case you want to explain why we use the scientific method to help students with to double check their answers there. All right, almost at the end of this first unit.